Okay, Guerra, Muerte against the odds. Okay, so what do we have to say? Well, first of all, it's not often that it happens, but it's not terribly often that I end up bailing from a game. And in this case, yeah, I had to. I really had to. I just couldn't. I couldn't keep facing it. That's not simply the rules, the mechanisms of the play, or anything like that. It's also that it had become pretty obvious to me that it was not going to. It was not going to change significantly once the Patriots got their asses handed to them completely. That there just wasn't enough time, and there really weren't any strategies to bring them back from how far they had fallen. So, the map I find quite pretty. It reminds me of an Empires and Arms type treatment, which is something that I enjoy seeing. And I can't fold it back. I feel that map making 101, or map folding 101. With the broad areas, the cities, the ports, the sea areas, everything, it's a pretty enough presentation of an area type conflict. There were some difficulties. I had trouble seeing where the mountain ridge goes, but you can kind of guess where it should be. There are questions as to whether or not, hey, is there a pass there that's so good that you don't have to deal with? Are there any passes? Is this a pass? There's no discussion of passes in the game. However, passes are obviously used to cross through the mountains, so which way does it go, Well, I chose that there were no passes because it's not clear one way or the other whether they're actually there. There also, it has these, it has army boxes, which the counters being in them cover up which army it is. And it's just difficult to see what's what. Thinking if there's any other issues here. The resource track, it might be nicer if it didn't, I don't know. The 15 worked fine with the plus 10 counters on it. For everyone except the royalists there, they didn't have enough numerical quantity, and I ended up truncating them regularly. If I didn't truncate them, and it doesn't, I don't think it says that it fails at 15, but if I didn't truncate them, they would have ended up with, just such a huge reserve of points that nothing could be changed. The actual counters, I have a lot of problems with these. First of all, they're glossy, and they tend to collect in big stacks, which means you try to pick up a big stack, and I'm not sure if you're using tweezers, fingers, whatever. It helps if you don't clip your counters, but I clip my counters, and they shoot all over the place. It sucks. I would far prefer to have had strength point counters and not really worried about individual units here. I know some people really like, oh yeah, that's the this, and I know the history of that, and that especially applies to people, who are kind of closer to the particular engagement. So, if your grandfather fought in World War II, you love that there's a counter for him, or likewise, great-great-grandfather in the American Civil War, you love that, you can tie your own history to that own counter. In general, for me, while I don't mind unit counters in a lot of cases, I kind of want, I don't like big stacks of unit counters. I try to avoid that as much as possible. I try to avoid the mechanical complexities that are involved in dealing with lots of different units. You can make arguments that, with certain types of games like buckets of dice systems and such not, that it makes sense to have these types of units. You know, I like OCS, and it has regular unit counters, and they end up in big stacks, so I don't know. I just definitely found it painful here, and painful without adding much, which did not thrill me. The player aid for the that you have to mark different locations on, etc. It doesn't include everything that's on the map, and some of the information you may want to keep is on there. Unfortunately, in the original, in the actual printed version of the game, those are on the back of the charts and tables, and there is no way that you could use counters on here if you wanted to do that somehow. And counters are supposed to go on here for sieges. I found a different way to handle sieges than that, using some auxiliary pieces that came with the game. The setup sheet, this is absolutely vital, and it's blank on the other side. You need it at the very beginning of the game. You don't need it ever again. It would have been a great place for this to be printed, and then you could keep counters on it as they suggest. This is also important because it's kind of the only place that tells you which nationality counters are, and it's the only place that contains a certain rule having to do with the reinforcements, which would be very, it's somewhat ambiguous. It would be much, much worse otherwise. These are things that were printed out, including the errata. The errata is not sufficient because the rulebook is pretty damn bad. My overall feeling with this game, and these are just suspicions or whatever, is that there was maybe a bigger, more interesting game originally, and it got pared down poorly to fit in the against the odds format. That's just a guess. The rules did not undergo the kind of development they should have. There are remnants of things that look like, well, there are places where there appear to be remnants of previous rule sets in place. Little things that just, it's like, yeah, why is that there? Now, obviously, there are games I love that have these kind of aspects. And I still had some hope that maybe this would be a similar type of circumstance. It just didn't work out that way for other reasons. But, something like Guerra has things like that, little artifacts on the map that are like, why is this there? And you have to get the computer game to understand what was intended there. In this case, obviously, there is no such, but maybe the original Spanish rules can give you a clue there. Overall, I felt like those hints and clues might have made for a more interesting game. In specific, there's this idea that there's a ranged battle procedure. Well, there's no melee battle procedure. So it sounded like originally maybe there was two different rounds to each combat or something like that, and that they were handled, similar to EU's handling. And that's not the case anymore. There are places where questions about the rules generated, gee, that doesn't make sense type situations. However, there's no way you can interpret the rules as written, including with the errata, that you can make it make total sense. So it's kind of like you're being left with two possible interpretations, neither of which really works. In other cases, there might be the use of words, like the use of the word occupied. It's not defined anywhere. I said that about complete and partial control, and I was wrong. But occupied isn't defined anywhere, and it seems to mean you got troops there, right, as opposed to something else. However, looking at it now, I would say probably after playing it a little bit, it likely is meant to be complete control, i.e. knocking everyone else's troops out of there. I never got into a naval combat. One of the reasons for that is there's no naval interception, and there's no possibility for the Patriots to kind of catch the Royalist fleet and fight it, even though the Patriots have advantages in naval combat. There's a bunch of little special case rules, some of which are very easy to forget. I kept forgetting the Royalist repression one and had to make that up. There's a number of places where the rules just fail completely. But the problem that I have is I don't see an exciting game, something that really captures me beyond that. This is a tremendously interesting subject matter to me. One of my viewers pointed this out, and I have to say it's what I've been thinking all along. It's why I bought the game. It's really interesting. I love the scope of it, that it's the whole revolution happening at once across multiple countries. It's not supposed to be a purely military game. But the different mechanisms feel lackluster. You count up points everywhere, and you can build as many troops as you like anywhere where you kind of have a presence, as long as there's enough forces there. Although there are some restrictions. There's, again, in the special rules, there are like units that can only be built in certain specific areas or whatever. And this is really easy stuff to forget. I ended up marking up some of my counters to remind me there's a special rule with this. But yeah, overall, the best that I could say about this is I feel like if I took the intentions of and the hints of the other game that seems to underlie this and have been in development at one point or another, and tried to flesh that out more, I think I would come closer to something I'd like. Something where maybe cities are different, from where cities actually are safe to be in, and not like, oh, look, the enemy walked into the area, I surrender. There's just a number of these weird little edge cases there. The way the attrition works, where small forces will get wiped out by attrition, large forces will take very little percentage-wise losses by crossing bad terrain. Again, doesn't really make a lot of sense. Maybe it does, that militia wouldn't be able to hold up for it, but it seems like that you should be able to create small patrolling forces that could slip through. Of course, there are reasons you wouldn't be able to do that because of the movement mechanism, the way that works. The rules for coordination are a little weird. You basically have, for the Royalists, you can coordinate everything you like. For the Patriots, except for some special case things that aren't really Royalist pieces, for the Patriots, you're divided into 3 sectors of the map, basically. 3 groups of nations, and they can't cooperate. And there's probably some historical relevance to that, which is that the Gran Colombia didn't work with Mexico really, and that the Peruvians didn't really work with the Chileans. Just things like that kind of work together, but it just felt kind of it felt very difficult to get any kind of it felt like that kind of whatever political intention there was there could be easily taken advantage of by the Royalists and force the Patriots into a position where they actually can't operate and present a threat to you, because a big rolling force of Royalists could just smash through things. The actual rules, sort of the core of the rules, isn't that hard. There's an uprisings phase, which I spent far too many mental cycles on. It's the possibility to add a couple of militia to the board. That might be necessary to kickstart yourself, to get back into the war as the Patriots. However, you can't do it once you're completely off the map, really. It's just too easy to wipe those things out for the Royalists. But it can get you into a region that's become a backwater because the Royalists had to commit forces to where you're strong. I was never really challenged as the Royalist, though. I never felt like my manpower was insufficient to handle every big force on the board throughout the entire game. It was just a matter of kind of reaching them in time. And you could take advantage of certain factors, like the fact that Peru doesn't have a very big force pool, so you can kind of let them rot because they're not going to go anywhere. The reinforcement rules are kind of a mess. I'm not sure I played them correctly, but I'm not sure I didn't. To me, to some extent, it feels like Spanish regulars should start in Spain and have to be shipped over or something like that. But no, they kind of freely get in there as long as they're not blocked by a Patriot fleet, which is illegal to do unless you're playing with an optional role anyway. And it doesn't call it out as, well, this doesn't really apply unless you have the option. No, it's kind of like the game was written with that option in mind, and they kind of pulled the optional rule out because maybe the naval rules didn't work properly or whatever, and changed things around a bit. It's an I go, you go game. You have to roll for your movement capacity, for the number of ops points you get with any particular force when you want to move it. That's kind of a neat thing. Once you see what your role is, then you see, okay, I have a limited number of things that I can do that's really strict at this point, so I might change my original plans based on that. Now, in the charts, you have a bunch of charts, and a lot of them are devoted to the combat roles themselves. The combat has sort of a, you roll off to see who gets these tactical options, and the tactical options are kind of a pain in the butt to handle mechanistic, in terms of the mechanics for them. But they help get you to an odds table, and they kind of, they perturb the odds table enough that you, even if you know what the enemy has, you can't be sure you'll be rolling on the table that you want to be. Cavalry, though, has a humongous impact on this. Whoever has the most cavalry gets a 2-point swing on the die roll, and that is really major the way the chart is built. The results, even on one-to-one combats, can be devastating in the sense that one side or the other can just be wiped out. Actually, on one-to-one, the attacker can't be wiped out. Now, granted, he has higher than one-to-one, but he can be hit in such a way that he becomes very vulnerable immediately afterwards. So, if the attacker's a patriot, he can be taken advantage of right away by the Royalists, but not vice versa. The attrition rules, I'm not really thrilled with them. They look like they were kind of patched together in the post-errata side of things. You're buying units, but the points that you get, you don't really control territory and resources in the same way that you do in a lot of games. Basically, someone else can sleaze into wherever you want using a rebellion or just slipping some guerrillas in there or whatever. Fairly safely. The counter-guerrilla table is really painful unless you have good leaders. Well, it can be really painful, or it can be completely it can be completely risk-free, but you end up expending effort on it. The risk factor becomes how many times you have to roll for. But you'll be losing probably real units eventually from it, whereas the guerrilla that you're trying to hunt down has to be a militia, which means they're almost worthless. I didn't get to a single naval combat, so I can't really talk too much about how that felt. Something seemed a little odd about it, which was that the ships of the line were pretty easy for the frigates to beat up. at least in my imagining of how the rule would play out. Uh, but I don't know. The siege table. Sieges, you really want to get good odds on, and you can improve them by building some siege works. That can be expensive in terms of time, but you can usually take a city if you can get something like decent odds on it. There is always the same defensive factor added by a fortress. So an empty fortress you can just walk in and take. That makes sense, right? It's empty. A single militia unit in it generates which is worth 1 strength point, generates 8 more strength points of defense. The 8 more strength points of defense will be there no matter what size force you put it there. And there's no limit to the size of the force you can put in a fortress, which all seems a little weird to me. There's a lot of weirdness going on here. A lot that I feel, really, this game needed a lot more development to get to the point where it was playable and reasonably enjoyable. I mean, it was playable if you make up rules for it and try to guess what's going on from the way they're written, and try to make a best attempt at that. But it just did not feel terribly good. Yeah, I don't know what to say in terms of how this affects my impression. I mean, obviously it's a negative effect on my impression of Against the Odds. I think I had a mostly positive impression from the last game that I played of theirs. And I definitely had a positive impression of the magazine, and I do for this one as well. But I'm not paying $30 for a magazine, I can go to the library and get myself some history for subjects that interest me. I do like magazines, but I feel like the time for those has long passed. Like the time for me to be willing to collect historical magazines that come with games has really passed. So then it comes down to, is the game good enough to, be the cost of not a full published hard map game or anything like that, but somewhere in that realm in a sense, and this one definitely isn't, and I fear that most of them really aren't. They give you a fair amount of counters, but the game's just not developed enough to qualify what's been done for it. And, the sad thing when something like this comes out, where it's the only game on a subject, and it doesn't get the attention that it deserves, and it doesn't get the work that it deserves, is that, it gets a bad rating, and everybody looks at it and says, well, I guess people really aren't that interested in it. There might be some exceptional situations where people have just been crying out for a long time for, hey, we really want this, and there just isn't anything out there for it. I don't know that this subject matter is interesting enough to enough people. It is to me, but I feel like a very different sort of game should have been made for it. I kind of wonder if the Empires in Arms America's expansion, or is that just North America? I'm not sure. Maybe is the better way to go. I've never played it. I've peeked at it. People said it on balance as Empires in Arms too much, and that it's really not. It's not a good thing to add to the game. But I feel almost like that's a rule system that comes closer to what I would like to see. It's less painful mechanically in terms of not having to count huge stacks of counters. The little perturbations that come off of rolling on that tactical matrix, they can be pretty major, but unlike the kinds of things that come out for me, in like EU or in Empires in Arms, from the multi-round combat, from chip selection, Empires in Arms, whatever. What this feels sort of, it doesn't feel like it's generating the same kind of narrative for me. I feel like I'm just getting it out of the way because it's a pain in the ass type of thing. It's certainly better than like battle cards and We the People and Hannibal, but but it just doesn't really feel like it helps all that much. The nice thing about it is kind of like the OCS rolls for, I don't know, surprise and stuff like that, column shifts that come off of it, is that it can have a fairly important effect kind of at random, but I would prefer that it was a little bit less painful to operate. It requires a roll-off to begin with, so each player has to roll a die. Then one player rolls 2 more dice, the other player rolls a die. Then they have to make decisions as to which units are affected by it, in a lot of cases, and whether or not they're taking a die roll modifier or affecting a unit. And this all requires looking at all the numbers. Now, that's not too hard if there are just a couple of counters out there, but sometimes there were some really big stacks facing each other off. And you might be looking at a situation where you could, get an extra strength point or something on the other guy and shift it to the 2-to-1 column, which might be better than a point on the die roll modifiers. And it just, I don't know, it just felt painful for what it was accomplishing. And that's honestly, I guess, my overview of the game, is it felt too painful for what it was accomplishing. Anyway, that's sadly what I have to say about this, because, I really kind of was looking forward to this as one that was on a topic that just has not been covered at all, really. and it just falls so far short of what I'd want from the game, and it was just too tedious and painful for me. So, let's end it up.